The grandfather clock in the east wing struck midnight, and Thaddeus Thorne did not flinch. He had heard that particular chime 23,000 times, give or take a century's worth of forgotten nights. The sound no longer carried meaning. It simply existed, like the dust motes suspended in the shaft of moonlight cutting across his mahogany desk, like the leather-bound volumes lining walls that stretched 3 stories toward a vaulted ceiling he'd commissioned in 1847. He sat motionless in the darkness, a sculpture of a man, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The temperature in the room hovered at 58 degrees. He kept it cold, always cold, because warmth reminded him of things that bled and breathed, and eventually stopped doing both. His eyes, colorless in the dim light, tracked the slow drift of shadows as clouds passed before the moon. A spider had built its web in the corner of the western window. He'd watched it work for 3 nights, admired its patience, its precision. The spider understood what he understood. Survival was architecture, carefully constructed, maintained in silence. The house around him breathed with the rhythm of mortal sleep. 42 heartbeats scattered across 5 floors. He could name each one by its cadence. Elara's steady pulse in the servants' quarters, slowing now as she descended into deeper sleep. Silas's irregular rhythm. The old ghoul's heart struggled more each year, a clock winding down. And the new one, the girl, Eulalie. Her heartbeat fluttered like a trapped bird, too fast even in sleep. Fear lived in her still, 3 weeks after her arrival. He could smell it in the air whenever she passed, sharp and metallic, mixing with the lemon oil she used on the furniture. He had not asked for a new maid. Elara had simply appeared one evening with the girl in tow, eyes downcast, explaining in her careful way that her daughter needed work, needed purpose, needed to be somewhere other than the streets of the city. Thaddeus had said nothing. He rarely said no to Elara. She had served him for 20 years without asking questions, without flinching when she glimpsed things she shouldn't have glimpsed. Loyalty, he had learned, was rarer than immortality. The girl's heartbeat changed. Thaddeus's eyes snapped toward the ceiling, tracking the sound as it moved through the floor above. Eulalie's pulse had jumped from sleep rhythm to waking panic in the space between one breath and the next. He heard the rustle of sheets, the soft impact of bare feet on cold floorboards. She was moving. At this hour, toward the stairs. He remained perfectly still, listening as she descended. Her footsteps were careful, practiced. She had learned which boards creaked, which to avoid. The girl was clever. She reached the second-floor landing and paused. Her breathing had gone shallow. She was afraid of being caught, but something pulled her forward anyway. Curiosity, perhaps, or compulsion. He had seen both drive mortals to spectacular acts of foolishness. The library door stood ajar. He never closed it. There was no point in doors when you could hear through walls, when you could sense the heat signature of a living body 3 rooms away. Eulalie appeared in the doorway, a pale ghost in her nightgown, a candle trembling in her hand. The flame cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the dark circles beneath her eyes. She had her mother's features, but none of her composure. She did not see him at first. The darkness in the corner where he sat was absolute, a pocket of shadow that swallowed light. She crept forward, her attention fixed on something across the room. Thaddeus followed her gaze and felt something cold settle in his chest, colder than usual, colder than the grave chill that had replaced his blood 6 centuries ago. She was staring at the portrait. It hung above the fireplace, massive and ornate, commissioned in 1873 by an artist whose name he'd forgotten, but whose hands had been steady enough to capture what Thaddeus had asked him to capture. A moment of happiness he'd thought would last forever. The painting showed a woman, dark-haired and luminous, seated in a garden. Beside her stood Thaddeus himself, younger looking then, softer somehow, his hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy. The boy had his mother's eyes and his father's solemn expression. Cyprian. Age 8 in the portrait. Age 10, when he'd been taken. Age nothing now, because the dead did not age. Eulalie moved closer to the fireplace, her candle raised high. Her lips were moving, forming silent words. Thaddeus's hearing, sharp enough to catch the whisper of a moth's wings at 50 paces, picked up the sound of her breath catching, the small gasp that preceded speech. "No," she whispered. "It cannot be." Thaddeus rose from his chair without sound, without breath, a shadow detaching from deeper shadows. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides that made no noise against the Persian rug. When he spoke, his voice was winter itself. "You should be abed." Eulalie spun, the candle nearly falling from her grip. Hot wax spilled across her fingers. She did not cry out. He gave her credit for that, but her pulse hammered so violently he could see it jumping in her throat. Her eyes went wide, searching the darkness, finding him at last. The fear scent intensified, flooding the space between them. "Forgive me, sir." Her voice shook, despite her attempt at steadiness. "I could not sleep. I thought a book might help." "You thought a book might help." He repeated her words without inflection, watching her face. She was lying. The lie tasted like copper in the air, mixing with her fear. At midnight, in the dark, while staring at a portrait instead of the shelves, her fingers tightened around the candlestick. "I was only, do not compound your trespass with further deception." He moved closer, deliberately, watching her fight the instinct to retreat. "You came here with purpose. Speak it." For a long moment, she said nothing. Her gaze flickered between his face and the portrait, back and forth, as though comparing, measuring, trying to reconcile something that made no sense. Thaddeus waited. He had centuries of practice in waiting. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft hiss of her candle flame and the relentless hammering of her heart. "The boy," she finally whispered. "In the painting, my son." The words came out harder than he'd intended. "Dead these 10 years." "No." She shook her head, and something shifted in her expression, fear giving way to something else, something that looked almost like defiance. "No, sir, that is, forgive me, but that is not possible." The temperature in the room dropped 5 degrees. Frost began to form on the window panes. Thaddeus felt his control slipping, felt the predator beneath the gentleman's mask beginning to show its teeth. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of centuries, the authority of something that had ruled in darkness since before her grandmother's grandmother had drawn breath. "Explain yourself." Quickly. Eulalie's hands were shaking so badly the candle flame guttered and nearly died. She clutched it with both hands, steadying it, steadying herself. When she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with tears, but her voice, when it came, was clear. "Sir," she said, and the words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Thaddeus had believed for a decade. "This boy lived with me in the orphanage." The world stopped. Thaddeus stood frozen, every muscle locked, every sense suddenly screaming. The girl's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Her scent, fear and truth mixed together, filled his lungs. Behind her, the portrait seemed to pulse in the candlelight, Cyprian's painted eyes staring down at them both, accusing, questioning, alive in ways that dead things should not be alive. "What did you say?" His voice had gone soft, deadly soft, the kind of soft that preceded violence. "St. Jude's Orphanage, in the city." Eulalie's words came faster now, tumbling over each other. He arrived 2 years ago. He never spoke, never told us his name, but the nuns called him Cyprian because he whispered it once in his sleep. He had nightmares, sir. Every night. He would wake screaming about, "Where is he now?" Thaddeus had crossed the distance between them, without meaning to, his hands gripping her shoulders, his face inches from hers. "Where is my son?" Eulily's eyes rolled back. She was going to faint. He could smell it. The sudden drop in her blood pressure, the way her knees began to buckle. He caught her, held her upright, forced himself to gentle his grip even as everything inside him howled for answers. "Please," he said, and the word cost him everything. "Please, tell me where." "He's gone," she whispered. 3 weeks ago. The same night Mother brought me here. He vanished from his bed. The nuns searched everywhere. But she stopped, her eyes fixed on something behind him, over his shoulder, widening in fresh terror. Thaddeus turned. In the doorway stood Silas, his ancient face grave, his gnarled hands clutching an envelope sealed with red wax. The seal bore a crest Thaddeus had not seen in half a century. A serpent devouring its own tail. Valerius's mark. "Master," Silas said quietly, "this arrived tonight. I thought it could wait until morning, but given," his eyes flickered to Eulalie, to the portrait, back to Thaddeus. "Perhaps you should read it now." Thaddeus took the envelope with hands that wanted to shake and would not let themselves. He broke the seal, unfolded the single sheet of parchment within. Read the words written in an elegant, familiar hand, asterisk. "My dear friend, I believe you have lost something precious. Come to the old place at dawn, and we shall discuss terms for its return. Come alone. Come quickly. The boy grows weaker by the hour." The letter fell from his fingers. The letter fell from his fingers. The letter fell from his fingers. For 3 seconds, the world contracted to a pinpoint of absolute clarity. The parchment drifted downward, catching the lamplight, casting shadows that writhed across the Persian rug like living things. Thaddeus watched it land, watched the elegant script blur as his vision sharpened beyond human capacity. Every fiber of the paper suddenly visible, every microscopic imperfection in the wax seal, now a canyon he could fall into. Valerius, the name was acid in his mouth. The name was a blade between his ribs. Behind him, Eulalie made a small sound, something between a whimper and a gasp. He'd forgotten she was there. Forgotten everything except the words burned into his retinas. Asterisk. The boy grows weaker by the hour. Silas. His voice came out wrong, too flat, too controlled. The voice he used when ordering executions in the old days, when his word could end bloodlines. "When did this arrive?" 20 minutes past, Master. A courier left it at the gate. Human. Paid in cash. He was gone before I could. The old place. Thaddeus turned, and Silas took an involuntary step back. Good. Even his most loyal servant could still recognize danger when it looked at him with naked eyes. "He means the estate, the original manor, the ruins in Blackwood Forest." Silas's papery voice cracked. "Master, that's a trap. He wants you isolated, away from—" "I know what he wants." Thaddeus crossed to the window in 3 strides. Dawn was still hours away, but he could feel it coming, that ancient enemy, that daily death. Time was collapsing. Cyprian was out there, somewhere in Valerius's hands, growing weaker, 12 years old and half-human, without the full strength of vampire blood to sustain him. How long could a Dampier child survive without feeding, without proper care? The glass fogged with his breath. He hadn't breathed in decades unless he chose to, but now his body was doing things without permission, responding to emotions he'd thought long buried. "The orphanage," he said. St. Jude's, where is it? Silence. He turned. Eulalie had collapsed into the chair by the fireplace, her face the color of old parchment. Silas stood frozen, the empty envelope still clutched in his gnarled hands. I asked a question. Master, Silas began carefully, if Valerius has the boy going to the orphanage, won't... He's been missing for 3 weeks. Thaddeus moved back toward them, forcing himself to walk at human speed, forcing his hands to unclench. Valerius sent this letter tonight, which means either he's had Cyprian for 3 weeks, or he took him recently from wherever the boy was hiding. Either way, St. Jude's is where this started. That's where I'll find the thread. Eulalie's head came up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was something fierce in them now, something that reminded him painfully of Eleanor. It's in the old quarter, Mercy Street. The grey building with the iron gates. She swallowed. But Sister Agnes won't tell you anything. She doesn't trust outsiders, and she especially doesn't trust men like me. Thaddeus smiled, and it was not a kind expression. She won't have a choice. The Bentley cut through the pre-dawn streets like a shark through dark water. Thaddeus drove himself, dismissing Silas's protests with a gesture. He needed the illusion of control, needed his hands on something solid while his mind spun through possibilities, each worse than the last. Valerius. They'd fought together in the Blood Wars, stood back to back when the old covens tried to burn them out of Prague. Valerius had been at his wedding to Eleanor, had toasted their union with wine mixed with his own blood, the highest honor one vampire could give another. And now this. The city transformed around him as he drove. The manicured estates and electric gates of his neighborhood gave way to older construction, brick and stone instead of glass and steel. Gas lamps still lined some of these streets, converted to electricity but maintaining their antique charm. The humans here liked their history, their sense of continuity. They had no idea how shallow their roots really were. St. Jude's Home for Orphaned Children announced itself with wrought iron gates that had seen better centuries. The building beyond was Victorian Gothic, all pointed arches and narrow windows, the kind of architecture designed to make children feel small and God feel large. A single light burned in a ground-floor window. The rest was darkness. Thaddeus parked across the street and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. His reflection stared back at him from the rearview mirror, and for a disorienting second he didn't recognize the face. When had those lines appeared around his eyes? When had his expression learned to hold that particular species of desperation? He looked mortal. He looked like a father. The thought steadied him. He crossed the street in silence, his footfalls making no sound on the cobblestones. The gate was locked, but locks were suggestions to creatures with his strength. He didn't break it, that would announce his presence too loudly. Instead he simply vaulted over the fence in one fluid motion, landing in the courtyard beyond, without disturbing the gravel. The building smelled of children. That peculiar mix of soap and sweat and growing bodies, underlaid with institutional cooking and old wood and the faint chemical tang of disinfectant. Beneath it all, another scent, fear. Old fear baked into the walls over decades. This was not a happy place. The front door was solid oak, locked with a deadbolt that would have stopped a human intruder. Thaddeus placed his palm flat against the wood and pushed gently, steadily, until something inside gave way with a soft crack. The door swung inward. The entrance hall was dark, except for a nightlight plugged into a socket near the stairs. Religious iconography covered every wall. Crosses, paintings of saints, a large portrait of the Virgin Mary with her sad, knowing eyes. Thaddeus felt their weight, the faith that had been poured into these symbols over the years. It didn't burn, that was Hollywood nonsense, but it pressed against his skin like a physical force, uncomfortable, unwelcome. He moved deeper into the building, following the scent of wakefulness. Someone was still up, somewhere in this warren of rooms. The light he'd seen from outside came from a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. An office by the look of it. He pushed the door open. The woman behind the desk was older than he'd expected, her face a map of wrinkles, her hair steel grey and pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a nun's habit, black and white and crisp, despite the late hour. She didn't look up when he entered, just continued writing in a leather-bound ledger, her pen scratching across the page with metronomic precision. "We're closed," she said. Her voice was surprisingly strong, no tremor of age in it. "Come back during visiting hours. Sister Agnes, I presume." Now she looked up. Her eyes were pale blue, sharp as broken glass, and they took in every detail of him in a single sweep. His expensive suit, his too perfect face, the wrongness that clung to him like a second skin. Her hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward the cross hanging from her belt. "I don't know you," she said flatly. "And you shouldn't be here." Thaddeus closed the door behind him and locked it. The click of the bolt was very loud in the small room. "I'm looking for information about a boy. Cyprian. He was brought here approximately 12 years ago. An infant. He left 3 weeks ago, under circumstances I need you to explain." Sister Agnes set down her pen with deliberate care. "I don't discuss our children with strangers, especially strangers who break into my orphanage in the middle of the night." Her eyes narrowed. "You're not human." It wasn't a question. Thaddeus felt something shift in the air between them. This woman had seen things, knew things. The cross at her belt wasn't just decoration. It was worn smooth from handling, and there were symbols carved into its surface that predated Christianity by centuries. Protection wards. Binding sigils. "No," he said simply. "I'm not, but I'm also not here to harm anyone. The boy is my son. I need to find him." "Your son?" Sister Agnes's laugh was bitter, humorless. "Creatures like you don't have sons. You have victims. You have prey. I have a child." The words came out harder than he intended. "A child I didn't know existed until tonight. A child who is now in danger because of what I am, because of my enemies. And you're going to tell me everything you know about where he went and who took him." The nun's hand closed around her cross. "And if I refuse?" Thaddeus met her eyes and let the glamour rise. It was an old power, older than his vampirism, something that had been in his bloodline even when he was human. The ability to compel, to persuade, to make truth flow like water from unwilling lips. He hated using it. It reminded him too much of what he'd become. But Cyprian was running out of time. "You won't refuse," he said softly, and pushed. Sister Agnes's pupils dilated. Her breathing slowed. The cross fell from her fingers, landing on the desk with a dull thud. "Tell me about Cyprian," Thaddeus said. "Everything. From the beginning." The words came slowly at first, then faster, tumbling over each other in the nun's monotone voice. A baby left on the doorstep, no note, no explanation. Unusual, even for an orphanage, because the child was clearly well cared for. Expensive blanket, hand-sewn clothes. Not the typical abandonment of poverty or shame. And the child himself was wrong. Beautiful, unnaturally so, with eyes that tracked movement too precisely, and a grip that left bruises on the nurse's arms. He didn't cry like normal infants. He watched. He waited. "We should have sent him away," Sister Agnes said, her voice distant, dreamy. "But there was money. An anonymous benefactor. Enough to keep the orphanage running, to feed all the children, to make repairs. The donations came monthly, always in cash, always with the stipulation that the boy be kept safe, be kept hidden." Thaddeus felt ice crystallize in his veins. Hidden from whom? The letter never said, just that he was in danger, that there were people looking for him, that he must never be adopted out, never be registered with the city, never appear in any official records. And you agreed to this. We agreed to survive. Sister Agnes's eyes were glassy, unfocused. This place was dying. The money saved us. Saved all the other children. One strange boy in exchange for 30 other lives. It seemed like a fair trade. Where did the money come from? A trust. Managed by a law firm in the city. Blackwood and Associates. Blackwood, the same name as the forest where Valerius wanted to meet. The same name as the original Thorn estate. The ruins where Thaddeus had been turned 6 centuries ago. Coincidence was not a concept he believed in. The boy, Thaddeus pressed. What happened to him as he grew? Sister Agnes's face twitched, some part of her fighting the compulsion. He was different, stronger than the other children. Faster. He didn't get sick, didn't get hurt, but he was also weak, in ways that didn't make sense. Sunlight made him ill. He couldn't eat regular food without vomiting. We had to feed him. She stopped, her throat working. Feed him what? Raw meat, blood, like an animal. The damper nature asserting itself. Cyprian was caught between two worlds, neither fully human nor fully vampire, needing sustenance that no orphanage could properly provide. Thaddeus thought of his son slowly starving, slowly weakening for 12 years, and the rage that rose in him was incandescent. 3 weeks ago, he said, forcing his voice to remain level. What happened? He disappeared. His bed was empty one morning. We searched everywhere, the building, the grounds, the neighborhood. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, no witnesses. It was as if he simply vanished, or was taken by someone who knew how to move unseen. Sister Agnes didn't respond. Her eyes were starting to clear, the glamour weakening. Thaddeus had one more question, the most important one. The law firm, Blackwood and Associates. Who runs it? I don't know. I've never met them. All our dealings were through letters and wire transfers. She blinked, and suddenly she was back, fully present, her hand scrabbling for the cross on her desk. What did you do to me? Thaddeus was already moving toward the door. Saved your life, he said. If I were the monster you think I am, you'd be dead. Remember that, sister. Remember that not everything that walks in darkness belongs to it. He was out of the office, down the hall, through the broken front door before she could respond. The night air hit him like a baptism, cool and clean after the oppressive atmosphere of the orphanage. Dawn was closer now, perhaps 2 hours away. He could feel it in his bones, that ancestral warning system that had kept his kind alive for millennia. Blackwood and Associates, a law firm that didn't exist in any directory he'd ever seen, managing a trust that paid to keep his son hidden and weak, and Valerius, his old friend, his brother-in-arms, using a name that connected directly to Thaddeus's own past. The pieces were assembling into a picture he didn't want to see. He pulled out his phone and dialed Silas. The old ghoul answered on the first ring. I need you to look into a law firm, Blackwood and Associates. I want to know who owns it, who runs it, every transaction they've made in the last 12 years. That will take time. You have until dawn. And Silas, check our own accounts. Our holdings. I want to know if any of our money has been moving through channels I didn't authorize. There was a pause. Master, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm following the evidence. Call me when you find something. He ended the call and stood in the middle of the empty street, letting the silence settle around him. Somewhere in this city, or beyond it, Cyprian was waiting, weakening, dying perhaps, if Valerius's letter was to be believed. The old place at dawn. Thaddeus looked east, toward where the Blackwood forest lay beyond the city limits. The ruins of the original Thorn Manor, where he'd been turned, where he'd died his first death, and been reborn into darkness. Valerius wanted him there, wanted him alone, wanted him desperate. Fine. He would go. But first, he needed to understand why. His phone buzzed. Silas, calling back far sooner than expected. Thaddeus answered without speaking. "Master." Silas's voice was shaking. "I found it. Blackwood and Associates. It's a shell company. The real owner is buried under 6 layers of corporate structure, but I traced it back. It's yours, Master. The firm is owned by the Thorn Family Trust. It's been operating under your name, using your money, for the last 50 years. The world tilted. That's impossible. I never authorized. The signatures are legitimate, notarized, legal. But Master, the dates, they all coincide with periods when you were in torpor, when you were sleeping through the decades." Torpor. The vampire sleep, the deep hibernation that his kind sometimes entered to escape boredom or grief or the weight of too many years. He'd done it 3 times in the last century. Once after Eleanor's death, once after the Second World War when the carnage had become too much even for him, once in the 1980s for reasons he could no longer remember. And during those times, someone else had been managing his affairs, someone with access to his accounts, his holdings, his legal authority. Who had power of attorney, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Valerius, Master. He's been your executor for 200 years. Of course it was Valerius. The man who'd stood beside him through centuries. The man who'd helped him build his fortune, manage his properties, maintain the facade of mortality through endless generations of false identities. The man he'd trusted with everything. The man who'd been funding an orphanage to keep his son hidden, weak and controllable. Thaddeus closed his eyes and saw it all with terrible clarity. Valerius discovering Eleanor's pregnancy. Valerius arranging for the child to disappear after her death. Valerius paying the orphanage to keep Cyprian alive but contained, never allowing him to develop his full power, never letting him become the threat he could be. But why? What did Valerius gain from hiding a Dampier child? The answer came like a blade between his ribs. Succession. In vampire society, bloodline was everything. A pure-blood vampire's child, even a half-human one, would have a legitimate claim to the father's title, his territory, his power. And Thaddeus was not just any vampire. He was a king, one of the old ones, with holdings and influence that spanned continents. If Cyprian died, or remained hidden and weak, Valerius would be next in line, would inherit everything, would become what he'd always wanted to be. Silas's voice was distant, tinny through the phone. "What do you want me to do?" Thaddeus opened his eyes. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that first hint of grey that preceded true dawn. He had perhaps 90 minutes before the sun rose and forced him to ground. 90 minutes to reach the Blackwood ruins. 90 minutes to face the man who'd betrayed him. "Nothing," he said. "Stay at the house. Protect Eulalie. If I don't return by nightfall, don't say that. If I don't return, everything goes to her. The estate, the accounts, all of it. She's Eleanor's daughter. She deserves you'll return," Silas said fiercely. "You'll return with the boy." Thaddeus wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe he could win this, could save his son, could somehow undo 12 years of betrayal and neglect. But he'd lived too long to believe in happy endings. "Perhaps," he said, and ended the call. The Bentley roared to life. He pointed it east, toward the forest, toward the ruins, toward whatever waited for him in the place where his mortality had ended 6 centuries ago. The streets blurred past, Empty at this hour, the city still sleeping. He pushed the car faster, racing the dawn, racing time itself. The forest appeared on the horizon, a dark smudge against the lightening sky. The road narrowed, became gravel, then dirt. Trees closed in on either side, ancient oaks and elms that had stood here long before he was born, that would stand here long after he was dust. The ruins emerged from the darkness like broken teeth. The original Thorn Manor burned during the Blood Wars, never rebuilt. Just tumbled stones and charred timbers, ivy-covered walls and empty windows that stared like blind eyes. This was where Valerius had turned him, where he'd drunk his first blood, where he'd learned what it meant to be a monster. This was where it would end. Thaddeus stopped the car and stepped out into the pre-dawn silence. The air smelled of earth and decay, and something else, something metallic and wrong. Blood. Recent blood. He moved toward the ruins, every sense alert, every muscle coiled. The glamour was useless here. Valerius was too old, too strong to be compelled. This would come down to force, to will, to which of them wanted victory more. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the ruined gatehouse. Valerius looked exactly as he had the last time they'd met, 50 years ago. Tall and elegant, with silver hair and eyes like chips of amber. He wore a dark suit, immaculate despite the surroundings, and he smiled when he saw Thaddeus. The smile of an old friend. The smile of a serpent. "Thaddeus," he said warmly. "Right on time. I knew you would come." Thaddeus stopped 10 feet away, keeping distance between them. "Where is he?" "Your son?" Valerius tilted his head. "Safe. For now. Though I must say you've been remarkably careless with your bloodline, leaving a pregnant woman unguarded, allowing your heir to grow up in an orphanage, half-starved and ignorant of his heritage. What kind of father are you? The kind who didn't know he existed. Thanks to you." Valerius's smile widened. "Ah, you've been doing your research. Good. I'd hoped you would. It makes this conversation so much more efficient." He spread his hands. "Yes, I arranged for the boy's concealment. Yes, I've been managing his care, or lack thereof, for the last 12 years. And yes, I'm the one who took him from St. Jude's 3 weeks ago. Because he's dangerous, Thaddeus. Surely you can see that. A Dhampir child with your blood, your power, your potential. If he were to reach maturity, to develop his full abilities, he could challenge you, could challenge me, could upset the entire balance of power we've spent centuries establishing. He's a child. He's a weapon, and weapons must be controlled." Thaddeus felt his fangs extend, his vision sharpening to predatory focus. "Where is he?" Valerius gestured toward the ruins. "Inside, in the old cellar where you were turned. Poetic, don't you think? The place where you died, the place where your son might die. Full circle. If you've hurt him, I haven't touched him. Yet. But dawn is coming, Thaddeus. And I'm afraid the cellar door is rather exposed to sunlight. If you want to reach him before the sun does, you'll need to get past me first." And there it was. The trap. The choice. Fight Valerius and risk the sun catching them both, or retreat and let his son die in darkness. Thaddeus smiled, and it was the smile of the king he'd once been, the warlord who'd conquered territories and broken armies. "You've made a mistake, old friend. Have I? You've given me something to fight for, something worth dying for. You can't match that. You're fighting for power, for position. I'm fighting for my son." Valerius's expression flickered, just for a moment, uncertainty. Fear. Good. Thaddeus moved. The fight was not elegant. Thaddeus moved with 6 centuries of accumulated violence, but Valerius had trained beside him for 4 of those centuries. They knew each other's patterns, each other's tells. The first exchange happened too fast for human eyes to follow, a blur of motion that ended with both of them 20 feet apart, circling. Blood dripped from Thaddeus's lip. Valerius's coat hung in shreds. "You've gotten slow," Valerius said, but his breathing was ragged. "You've gotten predictable." They clashed again. This time Thaddeus felt ribs crack under his fist, heard Valerius's grunt of pain. But the counterstrike caught him across the temple, and the world tilted sideways for a moment. He tasted copper, felt the ancient hunger rising, the beast that lived beneath his civilized veneer. The sky was lightening, grey bleeding into the eastern horizon. Minutes. He had minutes. Valerius saw it too, smiled through bloodied teeth. "Time's running out, old friend. What will it be? Your pride or your son?" Thaddeus stopped moving, stood perfectly still in the center of the ruined courtyard, rain plastering his hair to his skull. Let his shoulders drop. Let exhaustion show in the set of his jaw. Valerius's smile widened. "Finally seeing sense." "No," Thaddeus said quietly. "Finally seeing clearly." He turned his back on Valerius and walked toward the ruins. The expected attack came, Valerius's hand closing around his throat from behind, supernatural strength crushing his windpipe. Thaddeus had counted on it, had planned for it. He let himself be pulled backward, let Valerius think he had the advantage, and then drove his elbow back and up into the soft tissue beneath his attacker's jaw. Valerius's grip loosened. Not much. Enough. Thaddeus twisted, broke free, and this time when he struck, he put everything behind it, 600 years of loss and loneliness and rage at what had been stolen from him. His fist connected with Valerius's chest, and he felt the sternum give way, felt the body beneath the expensive suit crumple. Valerius hit the ground hard. Didn't get up. "Stay down," Thaddeus said. His voice was rough, damaged. "If you ever come near my son again, I will forget we were brothers. I will forget mercy. Do you understand?" Valerius coughed blood, nodded once. The sky was definitely lighter now. Thaddeus could feel it on his skin, that prickling awareness that meant dawn was coming. He had minutes at most. He ran. The cellar entrance was exactly where he remembered, a stone staircase descending into darkness, the door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. He took the steps 3 at a time, plunging into the cool relief of underground shadow. The air smelled of damp earth and old death, and something else, something living. "Cyprian?" His voice echoed in the confined space. For a terrible moment, there was only silence. Then, from the far corner, a small sound, a whimper. Thaddeus's enhanced vision cut through the darkness, like it was nothing. He saw the boy immediately huddled against the far wall, wrists bound with silver chains that had burned angry red welts into his skin. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, his clothes torn, but he was alive. Breathing. "Whole, Papa." The word hit Thaddeus harder than any of Valerius's blows. He crossed the cellar in 2 strides, falling to his knees beside his son. His hands shook as he examined the chains, found the lock, snapped it with brute force. The silver burned his palms, but he didn't care, didn't feel it. "I've got you," he said, gathering the small body into his arms. Cyprian was trembling, cold, despite the dampier metabolism that should have kept him warm. "I've got you. You're safe now. I knew you'd come." Cyprian's voice was muffled against Thaddeus's chest. "I told them you'd come. They said you wouldn't. They said you didn't want me. But I knew." Something broke inside Thaddeus's chest. Something that had been frozen for 12 years, maybe longer. "I always wanted you," he whispered into his son's hair. "From the moment I knew you existed. I'm so sorry, Cyprian. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. You're here now. Such simple words. Such absolute forgiveness. Thaddeus held his son tighter and felt the first rays of sunlight touch the world above them. They would have to wait, would have to stay in this cellar, this tomb of his human death, until nightfall. But for the first time in 600 years, waiting didn't feel like torture. It felt like grace. They emerged after sunset, Cyprian riding on Thaddeus's shoulders like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The boy chattered about the cellar's history, about the architecture of the ruins, about a book he'd been reading before Valerius took him. His voice was bright and quick and achingly alive. Thaddeus drank in every word. Silas was waiting with the car, his weathered face carefully neutral when he saw them. But Thaddeus caught the slight softening around his eyes, the way his shoulders dropped half an inch. "Sir, young master." "Home, Silas." "Yes, sir." The drive back was quiet, except for Cyprian's occasional observations about the passing landscape. Thaddeus kept one hand on his son's shoulder, needing the physical confirmation of his presence. Real. Solid. Here, Eulalie met them at the door, Elara hovering anxiously behind her. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale with exhaustion. She'd been crying. Worrying. "You found him," she breathed. "I found him." Cyprian twisted in Thaddeus's arms to look at Eulalie with open curiosity. "You're the one who told him, aren't you? The one who figured it out?" Eulalie blinked. Yes. Thank you." The boy's smile was radiant, uncomplicated. "I'm Cyprian." "Eulalie." "I know. Papa told me about you." Thaddeus felt Eulalie's gaze snap to him, questioning. He met her eyes and saw the understanding there, the recognition that something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer the isolated king in his tower. He was a father, and that changed everything. Later, after Cyprian had been fed and bathed and tucked into the bedroom that adjoined Thaddeus's own, after the household had settled into uneasy sleep, Thaddeus stood at his study window and watched the moon rise over his estate. His hands still bore the silver burns from breaking his son's chains. They would heal by morning, leave no trace, but he found himself reluctant to let them fade. They felt like proof, evidence of what he'd done, what he'd chosen. A soft knock at the door. "Come in." Eulalie entered, carrying a tea tray she set on his desk. "Elara thought you might want something. I told her you don't eat." But she insisted. "Your mother is wise. The ritual of tea has value beyond nutrition." Eulalie poured 2 cups, added honey to one, took the plain cup for herself. "Is he really your son?" "Yes." "And his mother was human, was kind, was gone before I knew she carried my child." Thaddeus accepted the cup she offered, let the warmth seep into his damaged palms. "I've made many mistakes in 6 centuries, Eulalie, but losing 12 years with Cyprian, that may be the one I regret most. You found him, though. That's what matters. Because you pushed me to look." She shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I just asked questions." "The right questions." Thaddeus sipped the tea, tasted honey and herbs, and something indefinably comforting. "I owe you a debt." "You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would do." "No," Thaddeus said gently. "You did what very few would dare. You challenged a monster in his own home. You demanded he remember his humanity. That takes courage." Eulalie's cheeks colored. She looked down at her tea. "Will he be safe now?" "Cyprian?" "Yes. Valerius won't trouble us again, and anyone else who might consider my son a threat." Thaddeus let his voice drop, let the ancient predator show through. "They will learn better." They sat in comfortable silence, drinking tea while the moon climbed higher. Somewhere in the house, Cyprian slept, safe and warm and home. Thaddeus could hear his heart beat, steady and strong, a rhythm he knew he would never tire of. "What happens now?" Eulalie asked finally. Thaddeus smiled. It felt strange on his face, unfamiliar, real. Now I learn to be a father. Now I teach my son what it means to walk between two worlds. Now," he paused, considering, "now I live, Eulalie, truly live. Perhaps for the first time in 600 years. She smiled back, and in her eyes he saw reflected hope, possibility, the future. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and roses and new beginnings. Inside, in the room next door, his son dreamed peacefully, and Thaddeus Thorn, King of Shadows, Lord of the Night, sat drinking tea with a 19-year-old girl who'd reminded him what it meant to be human. The darkness would always be part of him, but tonight, for the first time in centuries, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like home.